The Vietnam War, it's a name that brings up so many images, a conflict that spanned 2 whole decades. But what if the very thing that kicked it all off, the spark that lit the flame, was actually a mistake? We're going to get into how one of the world's biggest superpowers got drawn into a war that, honestly, changed everything.
Okay, before we dive into any of the politics, the strategy, any of that, let's just pause on this number for a second. Almost 4 million people. It's so easy to just see a number on a screen, but try to picture it. That's more than the entire population of a city like Los Angeles today. Every single one of those was a person, a soldier, a civilian, a mother, a father, a child. This is the real weight of what we're talking about.
So, the question is, how on earth did it come to this? How does a conflict in one corner of Southeast Asia just explode into a tragedy that pulls in the whole world? That's what we're going to unpack. We're going to trace the threads back to the beginning. All right, first things first. To really get what happened in Vietnam, you have to zoom way out. Think bigger. It wasn't just a local conflict. It was more like a single match thrown into a forest that was already drenched in gasoline. And that gasoline, well, that was the Cold War. So after World War II, you basically had these two global superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And they could not be more different. The US was all about democracy and free markets. The Soviets, they were pushing communism. And they were both completely convinced their way was the right way. Vietnam, it became this proxy battleground, a place where they could fight each other without actually going to war directly. And the tragic irony is that the Vietnamese people were the ones caught in the middle, paying the ultimate price for this global power struggle. And here's the idea that really drove American policy, the thing that probably kept presidents up at night. It was called the domino theory. It's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. They had this genuine fear that if Vietnam became communist, then boom, the next country would fall, and then the next, and the next, just like a line of dominoes. It seems kind of simple, right? But that one idea was powerful enough to justify sending hundreds of thousands of American troops to the other side of the planet. But here's the thing. The Cold War is just one piece of the puzzle. It's the big picture, for sure. But to really get it, we need to zoom right back in, down to Vietnam itself. Because this was a country already at war with itself long before the US military showed up in full force. Okay, so check this out. In 1954, the French colonial rule ends, a big moment. And the Geneva Accords are signed, which temporarily split the country into North and South. But here's the key part. They promised an election in 1956 to reunite the country. A chance for peace, for a single Vietnam. But that election, it never happened. The leader in the South, Ngo Dinh Diem, backed by the US, called it off. He was afraid the communists would win. And that one decision, it basically slammed the door on a peaceful solution and pretty much guaranteed a war. And this brings us to the guy the US was banking on, Ngo Dinh Diem. He was supposed to be the democratic alternative to communism in the North. The problem? He was a dictator. He was brutal to anyone who disagreed with him, his government was incredibly corrupt, and his policies really only helped the wealthy, alienating, most of the actual population. A lot of Vietnamese people saw him not as a leader, but as a puppet of the United States. So by 1963, things were so bad that even Diem's biggest supporter, the United States, had had enough. They basically gave a green light to a group of his own military officers to overthrow him. And they did. They overthrew him and assassinated him. But you know the saying, be careful what you wish for? Getting rid of Diem didn't stabilize things. Nope, it did the opposite. It threw the country into even more chaos and created this huge power vacuum, which just sucked the US in even deeper. So you've got this whole powder keg, right? A divided Vietnam, a global Cold War. All it needed was a spark. And that spark, that single moment that took this from a regional conflict to America's war, was something called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. It's a really murky story, something that happened in the dark that would literally change the world. So here's the official story, the one everyone in America heard in August 1964. The USS Maddox, a US destroyer, is just doing its thing in the Gulf of Tonkin, when out of nowhere, it's reportedly attacked by North Vietnamese boats. It fires back. Okay, pretty straightforward. But then, 2 days later, the Maddox and another ship, the USS Turner Joy, report they're under attack again. This is the story that went to Congress. But it's not the full story. Because, here's the bombshell. What if that second attack never actually happened? Yeah, we now know, thanks to documents that were kept secret for decades, that the second attack was almost certainly a mistake.
You have to picture it. It's a dark night, there's bad weather, the sailors are on high alert, and the radar starts showing these weird signals. They were probably just electronic glitches or even the storm itself, but in the chaos and fear, they thought they were enemy ships. They opened fire on ghosts. And this quote really nails it. This incident became the turning point. Based on this phantom attack, on what was likely just bad weather and jumpy radar operators, the US Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. It basically gave the president a blank check to do whatever he felt was necessary in Vietnam. And just like that, the door to full-scale war was blown wide open, all based on an event that probably never even happened. And so the war began. A full-blown American war in Vietnam. And the consequences, the scars, were just devastating. And they're not just in the history books. They're still felt today by millions of people. More than 58,000. That's the number of American names on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. 58,000 lives gone. A generation of young Americans who never got to come home. But as devastating as that number is, you have to understand the loss for the Vietnamese people was on a scale that is just almost impossible to comprehend. Around 3.5 million Vietnamese people, soldiers and civilians, lost their lives. Just let that sink in. A whole nation just torn apart. And the cost wasn't just measured in lives. Look at the financial cost to the U.S. alone. In today's money, we're talking about over $1 trillion. $1 trillion. Think of what that money could have done back home. It was an absolutely staggering amount of resources poured into the conflict. And the devastation goes even beyond that. The war deeply divided America politically in a way that's still felt. Environmentally, huge parts of Vietnam were destroyed by chemicals like Agent Orange. And psychologically, the trauma, the PTSD for soldiers and for Vietnamese civilians has lasted for generations. Millions of people became refugees, forced to flee their own homes. You know, the end of the war wasn't just the end of a war. It was bigger than that. It marked a massive shift in how the world saw power. For the first time, a superpower like the United States had been defeated by a much smaller, developing nation. It showed that military might has its limits. It really humbled America on the world stage. And in many ways, it reshaped the balance of power, especially in Asia. So when you look back, the Vietnam War feels like this perfect storm of flawed ideas, domino theories, and terrible miscalculations that led to an unimaginable tragedy. It taught the world some really painful lessons about power, about intervention, and about the human cost of war. So the real question for us today is, have we actually learned those lessons?